with us.
Oh, thank you, Casey. Thank you all for being here tonight, and I'm very happy to be in your new space. How wonderful. It's very glad to hear that you found one here in Campbell that, can not have to move too far from where you were. So let's just take a moment. I'm not going to do any formal prayers or anything tonight. This is a bit more of a secular topic, though obviously the Dharma is in everything that we do, as a Buddhist center. We try to bring the Buddhist teachings into all the activities, but let's just take a moment to at least set a good intention for being here. So just find a comfortable posture for doing a short reflection. We can begin with just a few minutes of watching the breath. Just kind of bring your awareness to the breath in whatever way you prefer. Work with the breath, keeping your attention there. Whenever the mind wanders, then just letting go of whatever distracted you and bringing the mind back to the breath. So I'll ring the little chime here to start this little reflection period, and then I'll come in and guide you in setting your intention for being here. So now let's just take a minute or two to set a good motivation for being here. And in this session tonight, we've titled this Creating Connection. Now, we are social beings. We are in the world with this idea of interdependence. Each of us related to others, having to interact with others. This is a part of our world as human beings. And it is important that we do what we can to create the best connections with others. Not just for our own welfare, but for their welfare as well. In our world, there certainly is much division, a lot of conflict. So we do need skills. We do need to learn how to navigate a world that can be very challenging and can be going against the idea of creating connection. So set a motivation for yourself tonight to gain what kind of skills, abilities, awareness that you can bring into your life to help to make your way through what we are going through in this country at this time, but of course what we always deal with, the reality of conflict, the reality of things not always going our way and certainly not going the way of many people. And we have to find a way to skillfully help others to be able to communicate with each other. So try to think about yourself and what you can develop, but also how you might be able to help others through whatever it is that you're able to learn tonight and to use in your life. And that's good enough for a motivation. So I just want to say a little bit about why I'm doing this. I don't know. I got involved in work around nonviolence a few years back, probably 3 or 4 years now. As we were kind of coming out of the pandemic, there was I do a lot of work with our interfaith group in Santa Fe. And there was one gentleman who I think is a retired Presbyterian minister, and he was very interested in our group trying to pursue the topic of nonviolence. And in particular, there was an organization called Pace e Bene. Pace e Bene used to, I think, be a branch of the Catholic Church, but it's now a secular organization. And they started a project kind of similar to Karen Armstrong's thing. She had a thing called Compassionate Cities. The Pace e Bene started Nonviolent Cities. And the idea is that you could become a charter organization. You could say, okay, we're going to be nonviolent Santa Fe. You could be nonviolent Campbell or nonviolent wherever. And the idea is that then you have a choice of whatever it is you want to do around the topic of nonviolence. And so what we decided we would do, primarily, though we do a few other things, is to work on creating workshops and education for people around nonviolence. I'm going to talk a little bit more about nonviolence in a moment, but I found this work to be really quite enriching. And of course, I'm doing this work generally with a team of people, not this talk tonight, but the workshop tomorrow in particular. There's usually at least 3 or 4, or well, 2 or 3 of us. We have 4 people in total now that are helping out with the workshops, and then we kind of take turns. And we're trying to get them as a more established thing in Santa Fe at the public library once a month or something, so we can offer these introductions to nonviolence, how to explore nonviolence. But again, I found it really quite enriching because I'm finding absolutely no conflict between what Buddhism teaches about all of this and what I am experiencing as I bring it out into the world, because it's very much grounded in the same sorts of ideas. So I'm hoping that tonight, I've never done a sort of introductory talk to this topic, but I'm going to introduce you to some of what I'm going to talk about tomorrow as well. I think there's probably still room in the workshop if you would like to join. Yeah, Bay's nodding her head. So if that's a possibility for you, then just show up 10 o'clock tomorrow. But I put a little slideshow together for tonight because I think it's useful to have something we can look at that will help to present the various topics that I'm going through. This is what I'm going to kind of focus on tonight, are kind of 4 things. The first one is really the foundations of nonviolence, and really talk about this topic of nonviolence. I won't spend a lot of time on that, but I think it's useful for us to really know what this principle is. And it does have different dimensions to it, depending upon whether we're talking about diminishing that in our interactions with others or even in our world, but it's all the same basic root. Then a little bit about what is mindful communication. There's one book called Say What You Mean that has a nice way of approaching this, and I'm just going to give you the briefest presentation of that. What I want to focus on tonight are what are called the 4 components, or sometimes we use the phrase in the workshop, the 4 steps of empathic connection or empathetic connection. They're really involved in what we know of as nonviolent communication. It's an organization, NVC, founded by Marshall Rosenberg and what have you. I think it's really useful to introduce those even in a talk like this tonight, because they are the sorts of things that you can begin to use and you can explore on your own. You don't need to have these great credentials to do it. I don't even have credentials in terms of being an NVC facilitator, but I've worked with some of this, and I really think that it's a useful approach to how we communicate with each other. And then I want to even do a little exercise in that. We won't do a big exercise. It's just an investigation that you can do on your own, and we'll share that a little bit together. I want to start with a quote from the wonderful Thich Nhat Hanh, Vietnamese Buddhist master who died a few years back. I'm sure all of you know of him. He says, "Nonviolence is not a principle. It is a flower that blooms on the ground of understanding and love. It is something to cultivate. The essence of nonviolence is love. Out of love and the willingness to act selflessly, strategies, tactics, and techniques for a nonviolent struggle arise naturally. Nonviolence is not a dogma. It is a process and it is a practice. It's something that we all can engage in. And the principles that we're going to look at in a moment are definitely behind it. But the essence of it is how we live our lives. This is boiling down, in essence, to this wonderful word that comes out of the Vedic Hindu tradition is ahimsa. Most of you have heard this word ahimsa before. It kind of literally means not injuring, not harming. And ahimsa is the fundamental principle that is behind so many of these Eastern traditions, and certainly has informed, Buddhism. The principle in and of itself, we could say, could be translated as nonviolence, because it means that we are going to live our lives diminishing, to the extent that we can, the harm that we are engaged in causing to other beings. Of course, the harm we cause to other beings, there's no way to extricate ourselves completely from that. I remember Lama Zopa Rinpoche, who many of you had met. He would say frequently that it's impossible in this human body to be divorced entirely from harm to other beings, right? Because we have lots of little creatures and what have you, microorganisms. Venerable Rabina often jokes that if you had a microscope under your armpit, it's a zoo under there. We got lots of little critters that are all on our bodies and our eyelids and everywhere else. It's impossible not to harm them just in the process of taking care of our bodies and taking a bath and shower or whatever. But then when you look at the food that we eat, even if you're vegan, you still are involved in some harm that accrues to sentient beings by virtue of having your vegetables or whatever it is you're eating. So ahimsa is a way of acknowledging that, yes, it's impossible to be completely free of that, but we're going to have an intention. We're going to live our lives with that desire to not be involved in the harm of others. Of course, in the Jain tradition, I believe it is, they do all these things like covering their mouths and sweeping in front of themselves so they don't walk over creatures and what have you. We don't go to those lengths. Maybe we should go to those lengths sometimes, but the idea is that, once more, we want to make sure that we at least live with that thought, that awareness. And the kind of corollary thought to it, of course, is compassion. Is the idea that we want to be involved in helping to relieve the suffering of others and not cause more suffering in our world. So that's the idea behind this ahimsa. Now, the second topic that was on the screen, I'll put it back on in a moment, was kind of the Buddhist view of all of this. Well, Buddhism, as some of the Eastern traditions, as you know, also subscribes to the idea of karma. So there is that element of recognizing that it's not just in the moment that there's harm happening when we do treat others poorly with our harsh speech, or we might do things that physically harm others. There's the ramifications of it karmically, that all of the things that we do, we have to experience the effects of in the future. So there's that concept that we also need to incorporate and have some understanding of. That's not going to be how I'm going to be presenting things tomorrow by any means. But I think it adds another dimension to our engagement in ahimsa, in non-harmfulness, because we see that we don't want to be complicit in the process, but we also don't want to experience the ill effects of harming others, of being in that kind of behavior. And of course, it also kind of links us to other people in harmful ways. Every time that someone harms you and you harm them back, you're just perpetuating that cycle of harm, because then you're creating the karma for them to harm you again and for you to harm them again, and you never break free of all of it. So there's another dimension, perhaps, to the practice of nonviolence. It's not just a good idea in Buddhism. It's actually the way that we stop suffering for ourselves and stop being engaged in the suffering that we cause to others. I do want to touch on a more secular way of approaching nonviolence, which is this last topic that we want to just touch on briefly for the topic of what is involved in nonviolence, the 6 principles of nonviolence that come from Martin Luther King Jr. There's also Gandhian violence. I decided to present the Kingian violence for this presentation, but you can also look up the way in which Gandhi practiced his whole orientation towards ahimsa in India, which I'm sure you're all aware of. Same principles, same ideas. These principles, the 6 that are presented here, I'm going to talk about them kind of the way that they're presented, but also there's a wonderful book by Kazu Haga. Kazu Haga, I think he lives in Southern California now, but he wrote a book called Healing Resistance, which is really a nice book on nonviolence and approaching nonviolence. And some of these he's got a slightly different orientation to, which I kind of like. The first one, nonviolence is a way of life for courageous people. I think we often think that being nonviolent means you're a doormat and everybody's going to step all over you, and it's kind of you're weak-willed or whatever. You're not going to do anything. Nonviolence is actually a very proactive response to what's going on in our world. It's not meant to be a way of hiding from all of that or in some way avoiding all of that. You don't get involved in harm, but you definitely make a stand. You definitely are out there doing things that will be counter to injustice in our world and the things that are causing harm to others and so on. I mean, again, we're seeing this in the United States now with all of the people who are out protesting and what have you. And it's been pretty admirable. And there are certainly pockets of people who engage in more violent protests, but it's nice to see people out there just having a nonviolent stance, not wanting to be involved in altercation and ways of causing more conflict in our world, right? The second one is that nonviolence seeks to win friendship and understanding. The way that Kazuhaga talks about this one, he talks about Martin Luther King Jr.'s concept of the beloved community. The beloved community is the framework for the future, is the way that he frames this one. It's a similar idea, win friendship and understanding. The beloved community is essentially Martin Luther King Jr.'s vision of a world that we would all ideally like to be involved in, where no one is excluded. We are all beloved. We are all involved in, and again, Buddhism very much supports this concept of interdependence. We cannot isolate ourselves out from the world around us. We can't say, my individual welfare is more important than anyone else's. We are interdependent. So this is what we're trying to do in any of our stances of nonviolence, is to win friendship, to not create enemies and more discord in our world. We want a community where we all belong. It's a wonderful concept, this idea of belonging. You know, so many people are feeling like they don't belong, and that's been causing a lot of the divisiveness. If we have that concept of we all belong and we are all part of the community embraced by this. Again, these are ideals. They're not necessarily things that we're going to see in our lifetime, but this is how we want to kind of live our lives in a stance of nonviolence. It also seeks to defeat injustice and not people. You know, the way that this is phrased by Kazuhaga, I really like too. He says, we attack forces of evil, not persons doing evil. His Holiness the Dalai Lama often talks about this, right, of kind of separating out the person from the actions of the person. The actions of the person, we can say, yes, are to be condemned and are to be do whatever we can to reverse those, to not have people engaging in acts that harm our environment and harm other beings and harm immigrants and all the things that are going on in our world, right? So that is perfectly fine, to fight the injustice, to fight the things that are wrong in terms of the actions that beings are involved in. But the beings themselves, the persons, they are to be seen, again, with love and compassion. And of course, in Buddhism, this is very much rooted in the idea that we all have this pure Buddha nature. We are all beings that are holy in some way, divine in some way. And I think this is held in other traditions as well, other spiritual traditions. So we can certainly see that there's justification for us to embrace the person with these positive thoughts while doing everything we can to decry and do what we can to avoid all of those negative actions that they're involved in and help them to change their behavior, right? The fourth one, nonviolence holds that suffering can educate and transform. This is a weird phrase. And I know when a lot of people say, well, you know, you want me to suffer more so I can be better capable and learn more and what have you. The way Kazuhaga talks about this, he says, accept suffering without retaliation for the sake of the cause to achieve the goal. This gets to be more about the idea of, particularly if you are engaged in nonviolent action, there may be suffering that is happening. Remember, there was this Christian pastor not too long ago that said, there will be martyrs in this battle, right? There will be people who unfortunately will lose their lives. We've already had several people who have lost their lives in terms of taking a stance and not, fighting violence with violence. And so suffering can educate and transform, and it can be a way of transcending getting down to that base level of fighting violence with violence, which is never going to get you anywhere. The Buddha himself in the Dhammapada, take it off screen, the Buddha in the Dhammapada has this wonderful quote that hatred is never ceased by hatred, but by love alone is healed. This is the ancient and eternal truth, he says. And it is. It's the truth. You never will overcome hatred with hatred. People keep trying to do that in our world, right? And it doesn't work. It only perpetuates hatred. I even hear some people challenge it. Well, what about like in World War II when, Hitler and the Nazis in Europe and all the horrific things that they were doing, and how the violence that was done to Hitler and the Nazis in Germany was justified because it stopped something from going on. Well, to some degree, yes, but did it abolish hatred? Did it abolish those sorts of attitudes and mentalities that are in our world still? I think we have to recognize that in general, you might have specific places where you could say maybe it might have some effect, but it's not going to do the trick because we're always going to keep going back to violence. And violence that we, use in any way is going to be violence still. There's very, very rarely, I keep alluding to some of the Buddhist teachings because I know most of you tonight here are Buddhists, but there's only like that one story that we're always told about when the Buddha was a bodhisattva and he used the violence to take the life of one person who was going to take the life of many other people. It's the only time. It's the ship's captain story, right? We've all heard it. It's the only story that is told about him actually choosing to engage in violence towards a being because he knew that it was going to cause harm to all of the others that were going to be killed by that being, but moreover, it was going to cause harm to that person who was going to then have to suffer the karmic consequences of killing so many people. So it's a very different scenario, right? It's not where he still is having compassion for everyone involved and recognizing in the moment that the only thing that made sense was to remove that person so that they wouldn't have all that negative karma and moreover, kill everyone else. So it's very, very rare that we can actually engage in violence with a pure motivation. Was there a pure motivation for, World War II and all that transpired? I don't know. I don't think so. I think there might have been some element of it that was on the side of what we might call right and good and justice. But at the same time, I think we get into, dangerous ground when we start saying that any particular form of violence we can just justify, for causes that may be very questionable or transitory. The next one, number 5, nonviolence chooses love instead of hate. And we can think about this in terms of, our external behavior, that we are choosing love, to always exhibit love and an acceptance and a wish for the well-being of others. But we also can think about it in regard to ourselves. There's a lot of nonviolence we practice on ourselves. Kazuhaga, in his chapter on this principle, he says that, he was working with some people in prison and thoughts that they had about themselves, their unworthiness and their, putting themselves down for what they had done to their lives was just unbelievable. Nonviolence often begins with how we even relate to ourselves and how we think about ourselves. So I think we have to acknowledge the universality of this. It's choosing love instead of hate in all dimensions, whether we're talking about others or whether we're talking about ourselves. And then the last one of these 6, that just again touching on these very briefly so we have some idea of what these principles of nonviolence are all about. Whoops, how did that come up? Whoops, got a weird thing on my screen here. Somehow my screen froze. I don't know what's going on with that. Nonviolence believes that the universe is on the side of justice, is what it says. Again, Buddhism doesn't talk about the universe so much, there's something that whoops, did I change the screen there? Okay, take it off for a moment. What is the universe? I think what we mean here in terms of Buddhist thinking is that in general, there's sort of the karmic functioning of things, that in general, because we do have at the essence of our being, this fundamental purity we were talking about, Buddha nature, that in the end, that will win out. His Holiness the Dalai Lama often speaks to this, that if we actually engage in many of these positive principles, like loving kindness and compassion and so on. Those are rooted in truth. They are grounded in the wisdom that we can cultivate, and they do not require that we have this distortion. Whereas all of the negative states of mind, all of our hatred, our animosity towards others, our jealousy, all these other negative states of mind, they're not rooted in reality. They're all rooted in the fundamental lie that we are being guided by, the ignorance that is the root of all of our problems. So in a Buddhist perspective, we can see it very much playing out because, as His Holiness says, if you have something that's grounded in truth, facing something that's grounded in lies, the truth will win out. It has more power. It has the ability to stand over time, much more so than the things that are built on lies and untruth. And again, I see this in other spiritual traditions, certainly, that people are subscribing to the idea that justice, goodness will win out in the end as well. And I think we have to have that as kind of a guiding principle. We do this work not because we expect immediate results, that just by us taking a stance in a nonviolent way that is going to turn everyone else around, but because we know that it's good for the long term. It's good for how we want the world to be in the future. So that's the idea behind nonviolence, and the way that I like to think of it as this kind of way of living by these various principles. Let me go on to talk a little bit about this small presentation, because the focus of tonight really is to say, okay, how do we take that idea of nonviolence and bring it down to a bit of a microcosm in terms of how we work with communicating with others? How do we create connection? As we said in the title there, how do we have peaceful dialogue and not end up exacerbating the conflict that we see in our world, in our interpersonal relationships? So I'm going to just introduce you briefly to these three ideas that are part of this book that I mentioned a short while ago. Oren J. Sofer, I think he's a Zen practitioner. I read another book by him that was really quite nice. This one, Say What You Mean, these are the three main sections to the book. The first one, leading with presence. We're going to talk a little bit about what that means, and the idea that we need to have some of the skill of being kind of aware and not checking out when we're talking with other people, right? I know that in our busy culture that we have, people are tending to just, not have the engagement with others that we would ideally like to have. The second one, come from curiosity and care. I've been seeing this word curiosity a lot. There's even a wonderful book called Seek that's all about the practice of stimulating our curiosity. A lot of the times we are not so curious about what's going on for others. And that's causing a lot of division in our world too, right? Because we don't necessarily care what the needs or what's going on for other people. And so we have to have some curiosity and care, some empathy for others. And then the third one is our attention, to focus on what matters. Yeah. There's a lot of things in our lives that don't necessarily matter as much, and we need to be really focused on how do we make sure that we have a good intention and really tend to what needs to change in regard to our own relationships with others. So I just got a few little quotes from Oren J. Sofer in his book that give you an introduction to each of these three ideas, because I think they're not completely rooted in Buddhism, but as you see, he's calling it mindful communication. Mindful and nonviolent, I think they're hand in hand. It might be two different approaches to the same thing, but certainly he's trying to help us to find the tools, the ways of approaching communication. So he says the first step is to lead with presence, which means that we show up as fully and completely as possible. And if we're on automatic, we're less likely to remember the tools we've learned, come from our best intentions, or access our own wisdom. Like the tools that I'm going to present for you in nonviolent communication, you have to have some kind of presence. You have to be able to bring them into what you're engaging in your conversations with others, particularly when there's conflict. Because otherwise, if we don't attend to that in that way, we're going to miss opportunities to have a more meaningful connection with others. So I think this is definitely something that we can develop through a lot of the skills that we learn in Buddhism, mindfulness, meditation, and what have you. But recognize still that many of us, we're dealing with very complicated lives these days, right? You have a lot of stuff going on. You have a lot of influences that are trying to pull you left and right and all over the place. And to be present with others really takes some concerted effort. A lot of people we don't necessarily really genuinely connect with. I think that this is one of the causes of so much of our discord in this country right now is people aren't really able to sit down with each other and be present with each other and hear what everyone else has to say. We don't want to hear what other people have to say often, right? Because we think we know what they're going to say. Well, that's what we're going to get into in terms of these skills of nonviolent communication, is that we often don't know what the needs of someone else, what they really are. We are interpreting that. We're putting on them what we project. And so we have to kind of remove some of that to some degree and be present with them in that openness. And that leads into the second one, which is the curiosity. The curiosity and this kind of care and concern is also obviously a very important part of our communication with others mindfully. This is to come from curiosity and care. Our intention can determine the whole tone and trajectory of a dialogue. Intention is where we're coming from inside. And intention is involved with this curiosity. Intention is a not knowing. It means that I am not aware of what's going on for this person in the moment, and I am curious about what is happening for them. Why do they feel the way that they do? Why are they saying the things that they're saying? I think curiosity is definitely, its time has come as something that is important for our culture. If we feel like through whatever influences we've have in our lives, we figured everybody out, we know their story, we know what they're about, we can write them off, well then we're never going to connect with them as human beings. We're going to always see them as just part of them that, we are othering and what have you. So the next part of this in terms of what he's saying, it's the motivation, this kind of intention coming from curiosity. It's the inner quality of heart behind our words or actions. You could say it's the vector that drives what's happening in one direction or another. Intention is about how and why we speak or listen. So again, for those of us practicing Buddhism, we know that our intention, our motivation is always a key part of how we want to approach our lives, is that we're trying not to shut anyone out. We're trying to be open and, again, compassionate, concerned, curious, having some level of empathy for ourselves as well as for others, because we understand our fundamental situation being identical. I mean, no matter who's on the other side of the fence, if you want to get into this kind of othering idea, they're like us in so many ways, right? The differences are very minimal when it comes down to it. But just because they have a difference of opinion, a difference of thinking, that doesn't mean that, they are completely other and something we can, again, pigeonhole and not be curious about what's going on for them. We have to have that empathy. We have to have that concern. So I like this principle as well because obviously it fits very neatly into what we practice in Buddhism, but also I think is a good part of how you would practice this even in a secular context, is to make sure that your intention of care and curiosity is there. The third step is about training, where we put our attention. Kind of, again, it was called focus on what matters, was the way he phrased it in terms of the main point. He says there are so many elements to a conversation. How do we sort out what's relevant from what's not? How do we determine what to address first? Training our attention is an invaluable resource in navigating these complexities. So he goes on to certainly, to talk about how we do need to train our attention. There's a lot going on, and even when you have a conversation with somebody, frequently there's so much happening for them in this day and age that it's hard to sort out, well, what is the big concern for them and what have you. That's why, again, the tools of nonviolent communication that we're going to move into bring everything down to some very basic universal needs. We do all have very common needs when it comes down to it. We just aren't very good at articulating those. And we get caught up in a lot of the static and everything else. And sometimes we're attending to the static, but we aren't looking at the deeper issues that are driving all the static. So we have to be very mindful and aware of that as well. What are we attending to? What is it that this person's really trying to communicate to me at this time? It was interesting. I had a friend in Santa Fe. I don't know if he's living in Santa Fe anymore. I haven't seen him in quite a while, but he had a bit of a frisky dog who liked to go out to the dog park, and would occasionally somebody would come up to him. It was annoyed at his dog and how it was playing with their dog or something like that. And he got in the habit of whenever somebody would come up to him and kind of start saying all this stuff at his face about whatever, he'd just say, well, what do you need from me? And of course, when we reverse it and we say, it's your job to tell me what you need, then people will get in touch with what they need very quickly. But, they get caught up once more. I call it the static, but we all know what it is. It's all the stuff that kind of keeps us at that level that doesn't allow us to go much deeper. To say, what do I really need at this point? We're going to examine this because needs are one of the fundamental things that we are involved in nonviolent communication, is to really see what is happening for that person, but also it starts with what's happening for myself. Now, as we get into this, I'll point out times when I feel like maybe you might see some conflict between Buddhism and what nonviolent communication is about, but I don't really think there's that much of a conflict. I think it actually can be practiced within the context of our Buddhist studies. Again, because I know that most of you are engaged in that, and you might have some resistance, especially when I start talking about your needs. A lot of people go, my needs aren't important. It's everyone else's needs, right? Bodhicitta, I got to take care of everybody else and forget my needs. But your needs are involved in all of that, We'll take a look at that. So maybe just check if there's any questions on what I presented as kind of a moving into this topic. Anything that anything people wanted to share, because this is a topic that I think, again, I'm not the only, I don't have any expertise in the room other than just having worked with this for a few months. So, yes, Asha.
Yeah. My question is that suppose we learn the foundations, we become really expert at it, which is very unlikely, but, we make an effort towards it. But the others have not gone through it.
Right.
They are not attending to the conflict out of love and curiosity and things like that.
Right.
What would happen? How do we deal with that?
I mean, the way they approach nonviolent communication, I'll share a slide that says this from their materials, is that it is something that we can practice even if others don't practice it. And it doesn't entail their practicing it necessarily. I think one of the things is if we get into these principles and how we actually are acting in the world, that becomes an invitation for others to be more direct in what they are communicating to us. So it's almost like we do it sort of by example. But it is interesting. What I'm going to share with you tonight is there's sort of these two ways of approaching it. There's the 4 steps that we look at in regard to ourselves and what we say to others and how we communicate. But then you can also use that as a way to interpret what's going on for the other person. But you phrase it like that. You say, well, what I think is going on for you is whatever. And then it invites the other person to say, no, that's not what's actually happening. So it's a tool that can also, I do think that just when we model it to other people, there is that opportunity for them to get clearer about what's going on for them, even though they don't know nonviolent communication and how to use it. But you can also use it as a way to initiate some dialogue about what's happening for others. And in some relationships, that may be quite comfortable. If you're dealing with a partner or a child or a parent or somebody that you're quite close to, it might be possible to have that type of dialogue where you can say, and to invite others to say, oh, I'm learning these tools around nonviolent communication. I'd like to use them with you, and I think it'll be helpful for our relationship. But if at any time it's not, then let me know, and we'll just go back to talking normally or whatever. The one thing about it is it's a little uncomfortable when we first start doing it because it is a bit of a formula. And you don't want to make it sound so, robotic or something like you're just going through the motions. It really has to become your own thing. And this is, again, why tomorrow we'll do a little bit more work on that as part of the afternoon, is really to work with these 4 steps so that we have a better grounding in them. What I want to do with tonight is kind of introduce you to them and also talk a little bit about what they aren't. Because if we get what they aren't, we have a better idea of what they are. I'll talk about what they are as well, but that's one of the ways that they approach it, is that they really try to help you to see that the way we often go about communicating, we're doing it in the wrong way, even when we do things that are similar to these steps. But back to what you said, Asha, I think we can engage in this very productively, even if others aren't. Yeah. was interesting. I, of course, never had the opportunity to be with Marshall Rosenberg, who designed all of this and everything. He, one of the people I do these workshops with, Ramos, he went to a 10-day workshop with Marshall Rosenberg down in Albuquerque. I'm going to tell you a little bit of his story because I think it's really quite inspiring. He was one of these sort of emergency people who would come in with the fire department when there's something going on that they're called to. And oftentimes it would be situations of conflict, of a domestic abuse situation, or it could be even people on the street who were out of control due to drugs or whatever and engaging in violent behavior. His story was that he got very good at restraining people. Like he would be able to show up on the scene and immediately kind of read what's going on and know that this person needs to be restrained so that they aren't going to harm others, which it's nice. You can do that. You know, it's a skill. I'm sure I don't have that skill to be able to restrain people and, you know, doing harm to others. But he went to this nonviolent communications workshop and he learned skills there that allowed him to use that type of an approach, a communication approach. He said that he realized over time that he had restrained like one person over the course of several years, whereas before he was restraining everybody pretty much. You know, almost any situation he went to, it was ending up having to do that. So he found that these tools of communication were really useful. And there you're dealing with people who, again, don't have that knowledge, right? But you're using it to help them to get at what's going on for them at a deeper level and really kind of pull it away from all of the really heavy-duty emotional content that can often be there. So I think it's really quite useful. So any other questions or comments before we go on? That's good. So yeah, that's actually going to be here, like I said, in something that I'm sharing with you in this next couple slides. So this is, again, these 4 components. As I said, we call them the 4 steps for empathic connection in the workshop tomorrow. These are, again, from an introduction to nonviolent communication from the Center for Nonviolent Communication, a man named Alan Seed, who I don't know as well, but I found his materials online, and I like the way he summarizes this. He says, NVC, nonviolent communication, even though it's really NC, I mean, the V is in there because it's technically not non-violent, it's nonviolent. Nonviolent is a way of everything being free of any sort of violence, as well as more positive. You know, anyway, I already talked about that to some degree. It's a way of speaking that facilitates the flow of communication needed to exchange information and resolve differences peacefully. It helps us identify our shared values and needs, encourages us to use language that increases goodwill, and avoid language that contributes to resentment or lowers self-esteem. Again, this sounds totally in line with what we're trying to do as Buddhist practitioners, right? We don't want to be involved in creating more conflict with others or perpetuating the conflict that's there. We want to have differences resolved peacefully. We want to, you know, be about creating more goodwill in our world, not creating resentment, certainly not lowering self-esteem of others. Nonviolent communication also focuses our attention on compassion as our motivation rather than fear, guilt, blame, or shame. It emphasizes taking personal responsibility for our choices and improving the quality of our relationships as our goal, which again is total bodhisattva stuff, right? You know, we want to have good relationships with others. We don't want to be, you know, having enmity between ourselves and especially those people who are more immediate in our lives. It is effective, as we were just talking about with Asha's question, even when the other person or group is not familiar with this process, because it does get at some very common stuff. And we're going to go into this idea of universal needs that was mentioned on the previous slide. It's really boiling it down once more to what is the core thing that's going on for ourselves and for others in the moment, so that we get rid of that static and don't get preoccupied with that. The 4 steps, and to introduce them very briefly, and then we'll go into each of them in a little bit more detail and talk about what they are, what they aren't. The first one is observations, which is to be very clear about what it is that we are experiencing in the moment. When we communicate this, we often start with the idea of when I see or when I hear, with the idea that we're going to be as truthful with that as we can, get it down to just the bare facts. So oftentimes, as we'll see, we say we're observing something, but what we're observing is actually a thought we're having about what's going on, as opposed to what is really going on. Okay? So that's the idea behind that first one, is can we get into just pure observational mode that's in the present with what is happening and is doing a kind of very clear assessment of that. Again, we'll be exploring this in more detail in just a moment. I'm just trying to introduce each of these so we have some idea. Feelings. My partner doesn't like me talking about feelings all the time. In Buddhism, we have this idea of feelings being just like a feeling tone, but here we are talking about the whole range of feelings that we're having. But feelings, too, can often be some thoughts can be misconstrued as feelings. Feelings are just what is the raw sort of emotional tone that is going on in the moment. Like sad or happy or, maybe insecure or annoyed. Essentially, we do have a hard time with the vocabulary around emotions. There's these wonderful things. I meant to pull it up before, actually. Let me go ahead and pull it up because I had it up there earlier. It's the, I don't know if it's junto or junto. Maybe you all have heard of this thing. It's the emotion wheel. And you can buy these things from the company, or you can find them on different websites. And you can't read it perhaps from there, but this is the emotion wheel. And you'll see that at the very center, it says, I'm feeling. And you have the yellow is love, the orange is fear, the kind of reddish magenta is anger, and then going around clockwise, the blue or purplish is sadness, the blue is surprise, and then the green is joy. I don't know if these were the emotions used in that one film. There was like 5 emotions in that film. What was that film called? I can't remember it. Inside Out. Yeah. Thank you, Gitu. Yeah. But anyway, we can boil down emotions to these core categories. And then you go to the next one, and there's like a whole nother set of things that are divisions within that. Like joy can have euphoric, excited, optimistic, proud, cheerful, happy, content, peaceful. Anyway, I'm just pointing out that I think we are not very good with our vocabulary around emotions. So we need to, as part of this exploring nonviolent communication, is get a larger palette, have more colors of emotions that you can refer to as to what's going on for you in the moment. We do tend to think happy, sad, and like that's not the whole range of that. And even within happy in what way? But this is, again, not to get caught up in a lot of the emotional static that you can have around this either, but to just boil it down once more to what is happening to you emotionally at that time. What are you feeling? So that's the second part of it. You have an observation, and then you have the feeling that is going on for you on the basis of what you're observing, what you are seeing or hearing. The third one is the one I've been alluding to already and what I've been talking about tonight, the needs. We all have these kind of fundamental universal needs. There's a handout that I'll use tomorrow, and I'll probably put it up on the screen today as well, but there's different ways of classifying these sorts of needs. But they essentially are things that we can all identify to some degree because we know that they're at the core of a lot of what we do. We just don't label them at that time. We think, oh, I need this and I need that, but we're once more caught up in this kind of other thinking about stuff as opposed to the deeper need that we do all have in common that is more universal. The last one is requests. And I'll talk more about requests obviously later as well, but requests is in that place of like we're going to actually then communicate to another on the basis of those first 3. What's going on, what I'm feeling, what my needs are at this time, what it is we would like to request, what it is that it kind of is from our side, an acknowledgement of what would be a useful way to address the need that we are not getting at that time. It's not being fulfilled. And again, it's something that it can have different dimensions to it, as we'll see. I don't want to talk about it too much here because we're going to go into it in more detail. It doesn't always have to be suggesting something that the other person then has to do for you. It can also be just wanting to engage in some more dialogue about it and what have you. We'll see that when we get to that. It's important to think about what it is that the requests that we actually want to make in that time. Because a lot of this will depend upon what's going on at that particular moment. Is it a situation of pretty high conflict and the energy is pretty intense? Or is it something where it's just a casual conversation and somebody has said or done something that you feel you need to, talk to them about? Okay, the very first one. I've taken this, and that presentation is from, everything I'm sharing here is from this nice shorter book called What We Say Matters. It's a nice book on nonviolent communication by this couple, Judith and Ike Lassiter. The first one, observations, on the left-hand side are everything that is kind of the best, the ideal way to work with this first step. On the right-hand side are the things that we tend to do. So observations are where we have an attention. Again, we talked about intention earlier, with our awareness of what's going on and an acceptance of what's going on. We're not trying to put any projections on it or anything. We're simply attending to what is happening in the moment. When I hear you say this, when I hear or when I see you throw a vase at the wall, whatever it is that's going on, it's just facts, right? I saw you throw a vase at the wall. When I see that, this is what's going on, right? And we're going to use an example in a moment. The at the bottom there on that left-hand side, it's essentially what happened, what is facts, and not alternative facts like some people put out there that there's alternative facts. It's what can be agreed upon pretty readily as facts. So again, it's not something that you're throwing on top of it. In other words, everything on the right-hand side. It's not an evaluation or a judgment. It's not, when you were a lunatic and threw the vase at the wall. It's, it's when you saw this happen, period. It's not putting any sort of judgment on the person who you're communicating with at the time. It's not an interpretation of it, nor a diagnosis, trying to get at the deeper things of what's going on for them. It's thinking about what happened is also off limits. You'll notice that it's kind of what happened is on the left-hand side, but thinking about what happened is on the right-hand side, right? It's our way of processing what's going on, analyzing what's going on, so that we have all this overthinking that we're doing that we are then going to project onto the other person. Again, that's not what this first step is all about at all. It's not also involved in moralistic judgment, saying this is right or wrong, this is good or bad. So when you say something like, when I saw you throw the vase against the wall, it's not saying it so that you're putting that person down and making them into, a horrible person because they did this. It's just simply, once more, a pure observation. And why are you doing this? I mean, I've been thinking about this as I've been working with all of this. Because the one thing you have to recognize is that if we do anything from the side of how we communicate with the other person that creates more conflict, it's not going to lead to the result that we are seeking, right? If we do anything that makes them feel less of a person, or makes them feel invalidated, or makes them feel that their needs don't matter, or any sort of value judgments that we're doing, it's not going to work, right? Because that's what we've been doing. I mean, I freely admit that I fall into those patterns very easily, especially with my partner. I think it's very challenging when it's people who are very close to us, because we know them so well. We get into patterns of talking to them that are really not very healthy at all. That might be a good place to start, to say, okay, let's take a look at our communication and how we're doing things, right? Because that's going to make a huge difference in your ability to then take it elsewhere. You can work with the person who's closest to you and who knows how to get your goat. Well, you can hopefully find that it works. But if you insult them right from the beginning, or say things that are going to be a value judgment of them, you're not going to have much luck. It's just closing the door right from the beginning. So here's an example. I'm using the example of somebody who is, and maybe this is two partners, who are with each other, and the one speaks loudly to the other one with a loud voice, right? Which, again, can often be seen as a pretty much an attack, right? So on the right-hand side, let's start with that one. This is what we might often say. Well, when you get mad and yell at me, right? Well, what are you doing? You're making a judgment there, right? First of all, you're saying that they're mad. We don't know what's going on for them. I mean, we might be able to gain some appreciation for what's happening in their face and their whatever, but we're putting that judgment on them, an interpretation of what they're doing. And yell at me, right? We are saying that they're yelling at us. They may not have that consciousness at all. Some people do talk fairly loud, and maybe we're not really that cognizant of where their vocal range is or what have you. We're trying to once more divorce ourselves from any of this type of judgment. On the other side is a more skillful way, perhaps, of phrasing this that will be more in line with nonviolent communication. When I hear you speak loudly to me, even the word loudly, when I first put this together, I'm going, is that a judgment or not? I mean, it is to some degree, but you could phrase this in even less of a judgment when you could say, when I hear you speak to me and what I think are loud and what I experience as loud words. That would be an even more precise way of approaching it. You know, because we're once more trying to take ownership of what's going on for ourselves in that moment. What's going on for ourselves is that we are experiencing those words that that person is saying as being loud. And that's what it's come down to. You know, the other person may not think they're loud. They may certainly not think that they're mad or that they're yelling at us. But we're going to try to avoid all of those sorts of judgments and just simply say, this is what's happening. This is what's going on for me. That's the observation, the experience that I'm having. Kind of peels back all that other stuff so that we can simply talk about facts. Right? Because there's no kind of juice behind those if we're divorcing all those other things, right? Is that clear in terms of, it's hard to practice. Trust me, this whole nonviolent communication thing, I might share something I'm going to share tomorrow as well, is that a lot of this is about getting out of our comfort zone. You know, we get very comfortable, as I was talking earlier with partners. Oftentimes we just talk to each other in ways that are really not good, but we just so habituated to do it, and it's comfortable to do it, and the other person never takes it in really, really bad ways to where they divorce us or, you know, they're out of town. But it creates this kind of pattern that isn't really good for communication. So anyway, let's go on to the second step, this feelings, right? Nothing more than feelings. All right, feelings. Let's talk about the left-hand side. Feelings are essentially emotions, even body sensations to some degree, right? We notice this when we're in conflict with another, that the body starts feeling a little weird and the heart starts racing, you know, all of that chemical change that's going on in our body when we're having particular feelings with conflict. Feedback about our needs. What essentially is happening with our feelings is that we are getting feedback about our needs that aren't being met at that time. So in the case of, we'll get to the language I'm using on the next slide around this example of somebody, I almost said yelling at you, somebody who you hear as using a loud voice and talking to you. When they are doing that, what is happening for you? Your feelings of being secure are not being met, right? Of having a kind of an emotional safety at that time. And so you're feeling insecure. That's actually how I worded this one. I think I feel insecure. That's taking ownership of what you feel. You know, it's not saying, oh, I feel attacked, because that's putting a judgment on the other person, that they're attacking you with those words, right? Giving you a preview of what comes on the next slide right there. I feel insecure versus I feel attacked. Those are very different thoughts, right? Attacked means the other person is attacking you. So you're giving a judgment on them on the basis of what you're feeling. It's not really, you're having a feeling of insecurity or a feeling of whatever concern, whatever is going on for you. Going back to this, the contrary side of this, the thing that we tend to do is we project thoughts, beliefs, opinions, images. Oftentimes these phrases, when we say them to others, they start with, I feel like, we could have phrased that one, I feel like you're attacking me. Well, that's not really a feeling, right? That is an assessment of what's going on, a thought about what's going on, because you're feeling insecure at that time. All right. So again, anytime that you start getting into that, well, I feel that, you know, you could be more understanding. I feel that. We use that phrase a lot, right? But we're not talking about those thoughts. We're talking about, what do you really feel at this moment? Now, why do we use feelings? rather, than these thoughts is because once more, that gets us down to also a common ground of understanding. We're going to talk about these universal needs, but feelings are also universal. We all have these various feelings, right? Any one of us can talk about a moment when we felt insecure, right? Because we know what that's like. And when someone says to you, I feel insecure right now, you know what they're talking about, right? You can put that in a category and say, oh, well, what's going on for you? What do you need, right? It's a need that isn't being met at that time. Anyway, I'll talk about needs more when we get to that. There's a little bit more on feelings I want to share on that right-hand side. Also, it comes down to these sorts of things, which I did point out a little bit earlier. You should not use these sorts of phrases. Why? Because it's implying the other person is doing something. I feel abandoned means the other person is abandoning you. I feel rejected, they're rejecting you. Betrayed, they're betraying you. Attacked, they're attacking you. So again, this is something that we should be careful about, because we often call these feelings, right? We say, oh, I'm feeling abandoned. Well, that implies that somebody else is doing this action of abandoning you. And that's, once more, a thought about the situation. It's a belief or an opinion about what's going on, but it may or may not be true. And you don't want to get into a battle over those things, right? That's what we generally do. Oh, I wasn't attacking you. You certainly were attacking me, right? And then you get into this back and forth that's just like trying to, and really all that happened once more, if you go back to the observation, was that you heard them speak in a way that you heard as loud, right? That's it. That's all that happened. I really like this technique because, again, it once more gets rid of the stuff that we get entangled in. That's what is the problem with communication often, is that we get all involved in all this stuff up here, but we're not down at the level of what's really happening for ourselves and, of course, what's really happening for the other person. And as I said, you can use these over time as you become more familiar yourself with people who have not had any experience with this, by saying things like, when I'm going to, just project it on you to say, and not from absolute truth, but to say, what I think is going on is that when you hear me say da 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 da, you feel fill in the blank because your need of da 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 isn't being met. And you can talk to others in that way, and you can say, am I correct? That's your request at the end of it. Did I convey correctly what's going on for you? And then you can have a whole conversation of what's going on. What is it they're really observing? What is it that they're feeling? What is it that their needs are? But again, until you work with it yourself, it's very hard to kind of get others to engage in this type of dialogue. And you don't want to be too opinionated, like, oh, that's not a feeling, that's a thought, be kind of all judgmental on them. Just want to say, could you maybe get to investigate what's the feeling that's underneath that thought? What is it that's going on for you? Just help them to investigate. That's what this whole process is about. So again, in terms of this hearing the speech, when I hear you speak in a way that I hear as loud, I feel insecure versus I feel attacked, right? Two different, very different ways of talking about it. The third one, the needs, is really this, huge category. Needs on the one side is universality. It's something we can all identify with, that we all have at some level. Versus strategies, and concrete behavior that we're asking for. There's a diversity to that. You could ask people to do a zillion and one things, but those are more about kind of the strategy that needs to happen on the basis of the needs that aren't being met, but they aren't the needs themselves. We get caught up in that a lot too, right? Trying to fix the other person and fix the problem, when we should dial it back to what are the needs at that time that aren't being met. It's life in action. It's universal qualities. It's things that we need to be aware of at the base level that are driving a lot of our actions. And it's not the action to meet the needs. It's the needs themselves, but not the action to meet the needs. If at this point in your conversation, you're expressing what actions the other person has to take in order to meet your needs, then you're off track. You should be just simply expressing what your needs are. It also is language that connects to life energy. It kind of comes from that space of that common humanity and common experience that we all have. It's an internal experience. independent of externals. Kind of, what's going on for us at that deeper level in the moment. It is not something that is specific to the person, time, and place. It's again, more universal. It has an applicability in various situations. And it is often, in the other side of it, the flip side of it, the strategies and what have you, those are often cultural, habitual, or conditioned. That's why, again, I pointed out the habitual aspect of it in terms of the relationships that we have. We often get into ways of kind of talking to others that are not really getting at our needs. They're getting caught up in how we want to fix something in the other person. What I need is for you to stop being such a jerk, right? What I need is for you just to shut the hell up, whatever. Hate to use such blunt language, but that's what we often do, right? What I need right now is you to get out of my face, but that's not your real need at the moment. What is your need? Your need is that you want that peace of mind, or you want something else, a state of happiness, well-being that is a deeper level, whatever is happening. That is getting at more, what is it that we need to do to help my needs to be met and your needs to be met? Because it's never just about our needs. Maybe this is where I will talk a little bit about this whole Buddhist thing, because in the one book that I mentioned earlier, the Say What You Mean, I think I have that book down on my bag here. Since it was smaller, I could bring it with me without not having it on my Kindle or whatever. But he says in there that, a lot of people who are Buddhists might think, well, again, my needs don't matter. Why am I so focused on my own needs? But trust me, you have your needs. And even when we go to, as we all know, this concept of bodhicitta, that was kind of a bit of it we meditated on tonight to set our motivation. We want to work on ourselves to be a benefit to others. Well, it starts with working on ourselves. That's meeting your own needs. That's finding kind of what works for you and what will bring you well-being and happiness. And the Buddhist path is all about that, right? So that you can then help others, right? So we never ignore our own needs. Our needs are intimately involved with the needs of others. And we all have these, again, universal basic needs that we need to be attentive to. I keep using need. That we should be attentive to, that we, are important for us to pay attention to. Let me actually put on there, I forgot to pull this up before the class as well, the one handout that had, where is that one? This is in the packet for tomorrow, by the way, as well, but no, I don't know where that is now. I have to go to my other thing. Anyway, I got it in front of me here on paper. Again, maybe, yeah, I think it is in the packet. It's this little handout that we have here. Some basic feelings we all have, and there's a list of those, but as you saw that wheel, you could find even more feelings on there that you can be more specific. But some basic needs we all have. One of them is autonomy, and there's certain things within autonomy. Physical nurturance, right? We need air, food, movement, whatever. We have things that sometimes are very base needs that might not be met at the time. Celebration, integrity, play, spiritual communion, interdependence, to have love, respect, acceptance, closeness, all these kinds of things in our lives. These are getting down to what are the needs that are driving us, rather than a story we tell about our needs or something else that is involved in, again, changing the other person or changing the situation. We just have to be in touch with that fundamental thing that's going on for us at the moment. Let me give you the example that I have, the language here in regard to the example I was using of somebody who is hearing the words of the other person as being loud. So they said, I feel insecure because I need emotional safety, and I hear your speech as threatening. Okay? Now, if you were on the receiving end of that, you might still take offense. Well, threatening? What are you talking about, right? But your observation and what you're saying here in your needs is that you need emotional safety, and you're hearing that person's speech as threatening. You're taking responsibility for how you're hearing it. So that's what makes it nonviolent communication. Somebody may still react to that word threatening, but the other side of it, if we were to use that language, I need you to not threaten me, then that's saying they are definitely threatening you. That's almost stating it as a fact, right? Whereas in the other one, you are stating simply the fact that this is how you're hearing that speech at that time. What you're hearing as loud is you're hearing as threatening, and therefore you're feeling insecure. Your need of emotional safety isn't being met at that time. I mean, you could stop and just say, because I need emotional safety, and maybe that's sufficient. To say, this is something I need in my relationship with others or whatever. I mean, they might be curious about that. What do you mean emotional safety? What are you talking about? But I think that's something we all have, right? We don't want to feel vulnerable, especially in close relationships and what have you all the time. There's going to be some vulnerability, but that is something that, again, if somebody is using a voice that you're hearing is quite loud, well, then that may be triggering that for you. Your emotional safety needs aren't being met. Very different from, again, telling them, I need you to not threaten me.
I want to join the second part.
Mm-hmm.
The second part after and in the first example,
Mm-hmm.
does that come as judgmental as well? I hear you speech as threatening, because that could be challenged as, oh, that's your perception, or you're exaggerating it.
Yeah.
I'm just talking.
I mean, again, I put it in there because I think that there are times when we can articulate that. But what I mentioned earlier, before we first got into these 4 steps, what I'm encouraging you to do is we have to read the situation to some degree. And if we know that we're in a comfortable enough situation because of our relationship with the other person and the history we have where we can say that, then maybe we can add those sorts of thoughts. These are based on some examples that I've gotten from books and what have you, and things that I think do work in certain environments. In some environments, if you're just in the grocery store and somebody, runs into you with their cart or something and gets really upset at you and starts yelling at you, and you don't know them or know what's going on, I don't know if you're even going to engage in this type of dialogue, but you can see that if you start talking about them threatening you, and that's how you're feeling, that their movement of their cart towards you is threatening for you, they may take great offense at that. But somebody who knows you well may not. So this does involve, to some degree, once more, being a bit more present and attentive to what's going on in that particular moment with that particular person, and then making a call about what it is that you would say, but always trying to once more remove any of the story stuff, the thought stuff that is going to be definitely taken as a judgment and as an assessment of what's happening. So, but I think articulating what's going on for us, or how we are experiencing something, is definitely one of the ways that Marshall Rosenberg taught this as a helpful way to express things. Because once more, you're taking ownership for how you are hearing that. I'm hearing that as threatening. I'm hearing that as, something that is unpleasant for me in the moment. Whether the person meant to be unpleasant with it or not is still, that's for them to answer to. And then we're going to talk about that in a moment, kind of how does this play out in terms of somebody else. If you have somebody else who knows the steps, then obviously it becomes different, because then they can express what's going on for them in a similar way. Well, when I hear you, that you heard me as loud, I think, or whatever, I feel, and that's because my need for whatever isn't being met, and So, yeah, so
this is your step 4, and if it is, stop me, because I don't want
That's
to
okay.
jump ahead here. But it's kind of almost like you're trying to say that, because of the loud voice, that makes me insecure, and I need to feel secure. And then there is a second part to it. If I need to, I need to feel secure in order to whatever that other person might be asking for, right? Maybe
Right.
the other person
Right.
was, asking me to give you a ride, let's just say, right? And we got into some altercation, and I might say that if you really need right from me, I need to feel secure, and that's why the loud voice is making me insecure right now, and that's going to prevent me from doing what
Right.
you want me to do. So in a sense, like you're kind of like explaining
Yeah.
why this. So it's almost like saying this negative emotion that is getting triggered in me is preventing me from doing exactly what you would want. I mean, you're looking for or asking for.
Yeah.
So if you want to help yourself, then I'm just thinking, is that the fourth? Does it go to that stating requirement part,
I
or that's something else?
I mean, I think that that can be part of it, but I don't think that that's the main gist. I mean, that we're not trying to make the other person kind of almost blackmail them into doing what we want them to do because their needs won't be met. I mean, I'm not sure that's exactly what you're saying, but the idea is that when we tack onto it, because like say this happened just before you arrived at a party, and so you don't want to go into the party having experienced this, what you heard as a loud voice and feeling threatened, when you're going to go and hang out with friends, and you need that emotional security so that you can enter into that environment without this hanging over your head and having potential conflict with that person in the party. So you wouldn't necessarily want to make it into some sort of threat and say, well, I need to have emotional security, or else I'm not going to go into the party with you, or we're going to go home and just, go in our separate rooms or whatever. You know what I'm saying? I mean, and again, I'm not sure that's exactly what you were saying, but I think when you start tacking on those kinds of conditional things, it becomes a bit of a threat to the other person then too. Hopefully they're invested enough in just wanting to have a good relationship.
Right. And that's really what I was thinking, because then the other person might say, well, I mean, you shouldn't feel insecure. You should, fix yourself, right? Almost like work on that. And I think it's because every time I have a loud voice, if you're going to do that, then, hey, you have a problem. I think that it's sort of, it instead of de-escalation, it can again lead to further.
And that's why, again, when we get to the fourth step, which is the request, it's important to think about what it is that you really want out of the other person or at that moment. And I'm going to give you a couple of alternative things. You could, if you wanted to, in this example we've been using, you could say, would you be willing to not use a loud voice when you talk to me? That may be a request you feel comfortable making, depending upon the person. But that may be going too far. You maybe need to have a conversation. So we'll see when we get to the request how we can. You've got some flexibility there. You don't have to say, I want you to do this. I mean, that's not really what you're saying anyway. You're saying, would you be willing? You're trying to engage it from the point of view of they're autonomous being that needs to make decisions for themselves about how they want to be in the world. But you would like to, in order to have your needs met and hopefully help them to have their needs met, then you want to make a request. So this last one, the request, is really important. And you might think that that's the easiest part, but it actually can be really difficult. Requests are requests for action. It's a response given freely, willingly. So again, you are looking for, not something that's coercion, not something that is going to get the other person to do something they don't want to do. Requests can also be seen as gifts of meeting needs. This is another way we can think about it in terms of our Buddhist stuff. I know when we express our needs, we often think that that's being selfish, self-centered, self-cherishing, whatever we use these terms, right? But it's actually a wonderful opportunity for the person to know what your needs are and to make a request of how they can help to meet them, because that gives them the opportunity to give you a gift, in a sense, to be involved in that interchange, that exchange with the other. So this is how we should be perceiving it, is that when I make a request of you at the end of this, it's an opportunity for you to help meet my needs, and in the process, hopefully meet your needs as well. Because we're never divorcing the other person's needs from our own either. I mean, that's not what nonviolent communication is about. It's recognizing that interdependence. Let's continue on this left-hand side. Requests are also clear, present, meaning in the present tense, something that can be done now, that are positive, and it's action language. It's like, would you be willing to do this? It's not, well, we'll look at the example in a moment. Let's go back to the previous slide and look at what it isn't. It isn't a demand. It isn't coercion. It isn't having power over the other person, which is what I was alluding to in answer to what you were saying, Suhas. And it's not also vague wants. Well, I want you to, because, or would you be willing to be a better person? Well, what does that, what does that mean? You know, that's pretty vague. It's not a denial of choice. Have to, should, must, can't. If you're using that kind of language in your requests, you must, stop using this loud voice with me. It's again giving them the option, the choice that they should have. It's also not a use of fear, shame, guilt, obligation, duty. Kind of laying that trip on someone else and making them feel bad about the situation, so that then they're going to be coerced to some degree to do that. It's also not a concept of deserving punishment or reward, like putting a value on what they did as negative and therefore they need to be punished, or, something needs to change in them and what have you from that vantage point. It's also certainly not a use of vague, abstract future language, like I was saying, you need to get it together and, become a better person. Well, again, let's look at the example that I have for this one. Again, this was the whole thing about the person speaking and what you heard as a loud voice that made you feel insecure and that you had your needs of emotional security not being met. Would you be willing to talk to me about this more right now? This is a much safer one in general, because it's not asking them to do more than engage in further dialogue about what's going on. And that dialogue could take a variety of shapes, but hopefully it still focuses on needs and feelings and what is going to be addressed by virtue of that interchange. The other one, the one that is not such a good idea, would be, you have to show me that you care about me or we're done, right? It's putting a demand to the other person, saying that you have to do this. It's also being incredibly vague, right? Show me that you care about me. Well, maybe the person thinks they care about you because they're using a loud voice. Maybe they really want you to be attentive to what they're saying so that you do what they would like you to do, but that's how they express their care. So it's very vague, and it's also giving them that kind of threat, saying, this is it, I'm not saying you can't get to a point in a relationship where you say something like that and say we're done, but you have to be willing. If this is somebody you genuinely want to be in communication with, it's much better to approach it from the point of view of the one on the left, right? What this all looks like when we put it together is the following. Okay, so the one at the top is the one from the pieces that I put together when we're not communicating with these principles in mind. When you get mad and yell at me, I feel I'm being attacked, and I need you to not threaten me. You have to show me that you care about me or we're done, right? I don't know if anyone's ever said those exact words, but you know the sentiment, right? It's kind of like an ultimatum sort of thing, and you're putting a lot of onus on the other person. You're making them into the enemy. They're the ones that are yelling at you, attacking you, threatening you, and so on, right? Now, if we use this language, when I hear you speak loudly to me, or as we wordsmithed it earlier, when I hear you speak words that I hear as loud, I feel insecure because I need emotional safety, and I hear your speech as threatening. Would you be willing to talk to me about this more right now? I mean, it's a very different approach, right? It's much softer. It has a tone of, I want to work with you on this. It doesn't have a tone of, you're the problem and you need to fix it, right? Okay. And another alternative to this, though, and something that is recommended frequently in nonviolent communication, is this form of active listening. So again, this is the same first parts of it, right? The observation, when I hear you speak in words that I hear as loud, I feel insecure. That's your feeling. Why? The need? Because I need emotional safety and I hear your speech is threatening. So that I'm sure we're understanding each other. Can you tell me what you heard me say? That's also a really powerful tool, right? Because it puts the ball back in their court and says, tell me what you heard me say. And they may go right to those words that we talked about as potentially problem words, right? Loud, threatening. They might say, well, what I heard you say is that you think I'm really loud and that sounds like a threat to you, right? And that I'm being a threat to you. It's like, let me say it in another way that I can hopefully convey what I really want to convey. And then you take another shot at it and you say it in as skillful a way as you can. And you can keep doing that. But the idea is you should eventually get to a place where you have some sort of a dialogue with the person about whatever it is that your needs that aren't being met at the time. And in the process of that, you may hear more about their needs that aren't being met. And that's the best way to go about rectifying things, right? Because then we're attentive to both of our needs. We're finding solutions for all of it together, interdependently, rather than saying, I need you to do this, and if you don't do that, I'm out of here. So that's the concept behind nonviolent communication. Again, it looks fairly simple in terms of these principles, but it's initially, I find certainly it's awkward, because you have to start using to some degree a bit of a formula. It doesn't have to look identical to that, but it has to have those components. And especially speaking to, again, the needs part of it. Those needs have to be expressed, and they have to be at that more universal level. Or else, once more, we're going to get into this bickering back and forth about, well, how could you say that? That's not true, whatever. If you really are in touch with what's going on for yourself, again, through your own inner awareness, being in touch with your feelings and your needs, then you can express those to another. And hopefully they can hear them, and they might even repeat them back to you, and hopefully they get kind of a good read on what you are sharing with them, and you can begin to have a more productive dialogue. But without that, then we're back up at that level again of all the static. So in terms of an exercise, I don't know, what I was proposing that we do, again, tomorrow in the workshop, we'll do more around particular scenarios where we're in a particular situation with another. Might be a sibling or might be a friend or whatever. But the idea is that you will play it out in there in terms of your word language, that would get clearer about these 4 steps. But I want you to just take a moment to recall a conflict you had with another person recently. And this is one which you would have liked to have gone differently. Where that interchange with them, didn't solve anything. It only kept your needs from being met and probably kept that other person in a pattern of doing things that are adverse to your needs. They're against what you need. And again, also not helping them to have their needs met, no doubt. So again, we can just take a moment to think about that. And then we'll go to the rest of the exercise. And you don't have to necessarily share this, but if someone's willing to share a particular conflict they had with another person that they would have liked to have gone differently, maybe not somebody else who's in the room, though, because that might get tricky. But if you have something that you had an interchange with somebody that you would like to share, maybe it's useful to have that shared here. And we don't have to record this, by the way, if you want to pause the recording so that you can share something. But let's just take a moment to think about what is a time when you had some conflict with another that you would have liked to have gone differently. Does everybody have kind of something that they're thinking about? Yeah. So again, we're not trying to we're not trying to stir up everything by doing this. We're actually trying to be wise and look back at that situation and identify these 4 components. Try to bring it down to that level so you would get more clearly what you would communicate at that time. So in terms of an observation, what was it that was actually happening for you? It's when I see, when I hear, when I experience, essentially, something going on. And it's in regard to that person, right? But it's not putting the onus on them. It is your experience of that. Right? Does anyone have one that they'd like to share, or even just that thought? You don't have to share the whole scenario. You can just share what came to mind when you boil it down to that observation. Anyone? Okay.
My question, I think, related to the conversation we had, it seems like even though there is not necessarily an assumption that there's intention to communicate on both parties, but it seems like that's what this modality is for. But so my question is, what if the other party doesn't want to communicate? Right? A request. What if the answer is no?
Would you be willing to discuss this more? No. I think we have to respect that and just say, okay, and then you could say to them a second request. Well, would you be willing to talk about this tomorrow? Or and then you could certainly ask the other person to express in a similar format, at least get to what's going on for them. What is it that they're observing, feeling, what needs they have at that time that are causing them to say no? I mean, they may not want to engage in that level of dialogue because they already told you no, they don't want to talk about it. But I think at some point, if they're not going to be kind of a party to at least going deeper at some point and really exploring it, then it's going to be challenging. Yeah.
And related to that, it's nowadays it seems like you need a little bit of a permission to even engage in the first place.
Right.
To even like want to list all of the
The sort of feelings, needs. Yeah.
So just curious whether that is something that's recommended to even ask some kind of like an invitation.
Right.
I would say
No.
permission
No.
to
Yeah.
even be in this kind of conversation.
And I haven't seen it in the materials, but in our day and age, that's probably not a bad idea, because certainly one of the things when we talked about attention, there's a lot going on in people's lives, and that may not be the appropriate time, certainly, for us to have that dialogue. But to have that kind of permission to explore with another, I think is natural step in many situations. So if it feels like it needs to be there in order to create the opportunity to engage, then absolutely, I wouldn't see any problem with it. Because it's just simply saying, can we have this dialogue at this time? Is this something you're open to? No. But yeah, I've been thinking about what you said about, when they say no. Were you going to say something to us?
I was going to take a leaf out of my work thing. One of the things we do a lot of surveys for events and so on. So one of the questions we'll usually ask is, would you like to have support from our team?
Mm-hmm.
And over time, I've realized that giving an option no is not a good, because that allows the other person to shut the door. Giving that option.
Uh-huh.
Because then what do you do? Like what we are saying now, right? Once the person says no, where do you go from there? So framing the question in such a way that no is not one of the options, or at least not the first. Well, I mean, in a sense, because again, it might be like you're saying, something. Would you like to discuss it now, or later? Maybe you want to come back at some point, and so giving 2 or 3, and then it. I mean, there's still going to be like if not an explicit no, there's going to be an implicit no anyway, because if the person doesn't want to respond,
right,
there's always she or he's already always has that option, and that that's always there, but that's not what you're talking about. You're talking about the other options. So one other thing I was going to say is also, I think what she was alluding to, the tone is in that request. Again, it's a request. It's a sort of a very intention of very well-hearted intent, request, and doesn't sound like a demand. Like you can say the same thing. Would you be willing to talk about this now or later? Or you can say that like in 5 different ways, all the way from very demanding to very compassionate would be the other sort of extreme of it. But that's all I wanted to.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, again, I do think that it's good to keep it in that tone, though, of would you be willing? Because it really is, it's a request, but it's not a demand, as we saw. We're never wanting to demand that somebody do something or threaten them with consequences if they don't. We really want to keep it as an open invitation, that would you be willing to do this? And again, if we find that the relationship has some ground and it's going to grow from there, well, then they probably will be. But if we get a closed door, well, it could be an indicative of other things that, that person is not at a stage in their life where they're really ready to kind of approach all this. I think in general, people do find that being worded as an invitation, that they're more likely to say, well, yeah, I'd be happy to explore this with you, but maybe not right now, or maybe, when I calm down more, or whatever the case might be. Maybe we didn't read it all right, and they're still in a very, delicate place, vulnerable place. But, again, the request is really our chance to invite a further exploration of all of it, because once more, we don't want it to be unilateral. It's not just us saying, this is what's going on for me, and to hell with you. It's me saying, I value what I have in my relationship with you, and I want to be able to express what's going on for me so we can each be attentive to each other. That's the idea behind it. Yeah. Oh, microphone.
Or even in that, add another, or if you have any ideas of how we can take this forward, that might be another way to, it's not just me saying, these are the only ways to go forward, but I'm willing to listen to your, if you have any, if you have any ideas. So.
Okay. We're needing to wrap up pretty soon here. We're at we've been sitting for almost 2 hours. It's a long time. Any other final comments or questions? I do want to share just a little quote from Marshall Rosenberg, I think, that I put at the end, if I recall what I did earlier. And I like this because, again, this is where we've been looking at it primarily from the side of our own feelings and so on and all of this. But we have to be willing to engage in this understanding that he's alluding to here. All criticism, attack, insults, and judgments vanish when we focus attention on hearing the feelings and needs behind a message. And this is something we're going to explore a little bit tomorrow as well. The more we practice in this way, the more we realize a simple truth. Behind all those messages we've allowed ourselves to be intimidated by are just individuals with unmet needs appealing to us to contribute to their well-being. So needs is really at the bottom of all of this in many, many ways. When we have conflict with another, it's generally because their needs aren't being met. Maybe that would even be an alternate for the request. Well, would you be willing to share with me what needs aren't being met for you at this time? And there's nothing wrong with that. Again, a request should be positive oriented. It should be about something you can do as much as possible in the present, not something you're going to put off for, 10 years or something. It's something that you will think will be constructive in regard to your communication with the other person. So those sorts of things I think are useful. But anyway, I'm still pretty much a novice at a lot of this, so I feel a little weird kind of talking about it in some ways, but nonetheless, I've learned a lot from Ramos, who does the workshop with me, and his use of it and everything is really quite skillful. So it's something like anything. It's the first time you do it, it's always a little uncomfortable, right? And then even over time, that discomfort begins to go away, and then eventually it's second nature, and it's just how we relate to each other. I think it's really quite useful, though, in my experience. So, any other questions from folks online or anything, or here in the Gompa comments? Certainly, Marshall Rosenberg himself has a book out on nonviolent communication. It's well worth reading. The one that I mentioned, Say What You Mean, is quite nice. That had those 3 things that we talked about, the foundations of mindful communication. And then the other one that was the one I have in my pack here. Get that book out. It's called What We Say Matters. Okay. Oops. Somewhere there. Anyway. All right. Well, let's go ahead and just have some final thoughts. In, Buddhist terms, we always do this idea of dedicating, but we don't have to think about it in quite strict terms, but just some positive thoughts about what we've done here together tonight. Looking at more skillful ways of connecting to others, trying to create more peaceful dialogue with those that we interact with, so that can become like dropping pebbles in a pond and the ripples going out in all directions. what we do in regard to our communication with others has an impact on the world. Every person we talk to in a more skillful way hopefully leads them to be more skillful and more aware of their conversations with others. So I think that we're contributing to peace in this world, peace among beings, through what we've done here tonight, and dedicating for that. And that we ourselves may be able to influence others through our own communication, to be able to find ways to find genuine connection, harmony, and kind of a coming together of being, so that we can all experience the happiness and freedom from suffering that is kind of our birthright, something we all have the potential to attain. Okay, thank you all for joining. Appreciate everyone being flexible and working with us a little bit tonight. These slides I will give to Bei so that you have them to refer to, and you're certainly welcome to work with those. And if you can come to the workshop tomorrow, again, it'll be from 10 to 4:30 with about an hour and a half break in the middle. So it's 2 hours of workshop in the morning and 3 hours in the afternoon. And I think you'll find it very engaging. I find the time goes by incredibly quickly because it is more workshop-y. We're going to be doing various exercises and getting into small groups, as well as writing out responses to things and what have you. And I think you'll find it useful because we're going to go all the way from just what is nonviolence all the way through this NVC process that we talked about tonight. So, okay, everyone, be well. Thank you so much.